Europe did not fall because an empire invaded it. Europe fell because every empire believed God was on their side. The 30 Years' War was not a conflict. It was a continent-wide suicide. A war where priests blessed armies that burned churches, kings murdered their own people in God's name. Nations switched faiths the way soldiers changed weapons, and entire regions vanished, not conquered, erased. This was the war where half of Germany died. Cities turned into skeletons, crops rotted because no one lived long enough to harvest them. Wolves walked into abandoned towns. And Europe learned, painfully, that there is no hatred more absolute than the hatred between two men who believe they have the same God. The 30 Years' War did not reshape Europe. It destroyed the Europe that came before. And when the smoke cleared, the survivors were forced to ask a question no Christian nation ever dared confront. If this war was God's will, why did God look exactly like our own ambitions? This is the story of the moment the cross fractured, and Europe tore itself apart trying to hold the pieces. Every catastrophe begins with a certainty. For Europe, that certainty was simple. God would never allow Christians to destroy Christians. They were wrong. By the early 1600s, Europe looked peaceful on the surface. But beneath that surface, fire. Since Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses in 1517, the continent had been split in two. Protestants, who believed salvation came through Scripture, not Rome. Catholics, who believed the Church was the keeper of truth. In theory, both sides worshipped Christ. In practice, they worshipped certainty. The belief that only their interpretation could save Europe from damnation. Kingdoms didn't see neighbors. They saw heretics. And heretics were not opponents. Heretics were threats to eternity. The Reformation had not created two Europes. It had created two realities forced to share the same land. A world like that doesn't need enemies. It creates them. Nowhere was the tension worse than the place ironically named the Holy Roman Empire. A patchwork of 300+ states. Some Catholic, some Protestant, some Lutheran, some Calvinist, some both on alternate Tuesdays, depending on who marched through. Its rulers pretended stability. Its people pretended unity. Its borders pretended meaning. It was not an empire. It was a truce wearing a crown. And everyone knew a truce is only as strong as the men willing to die for it. No one was. In 1618, Catholic envoys entered Prague to discipline Protestant nobles. The nobles responded by grabbing the envoys and throwing them out the castle window. A 70-foot drop. This moment is known as the Defenestration of Prague. The kind of event that sounds comedic until you remember what followed. The envoys survived by landing in a pile of manure. Catholics called it a miracle. Protestants called it dumb luck. Europe called it a coincidence, but history called it something else. The beginning of a war that would erase a generation. Why did this incident matter so much? Because it proved a truth Europe refused to accept. No one respected the truce anymore. And if a truce is not respected, it ceases to be a truce. It becomes an illusion waiting to collapse. After Prague, Europe's rulers had two choices. 1. Calm the situation. 2. Use it as an excuse to settle old scores. They chose the second. The Habsburg Emperor saw a chance to crush Protestantism. Protestant princes saw a chance to escape Catholic domination. Spain saw a chance to expand its empire. Sweden saw a chance to become an empire. France, ironically Catholic, saw a chance to weaken the Catholic Habsburgs. The 30 Years' War began as a local conflict. It became a continental fire because every king looked at the smoke and said, "This is my moment." When faith mixes with ambition, it doesn't purify it. It weaponizes it. The war began awkwardly. Small battles, messy alliances, armies stumbling into each other more by accident than strategy. Both sides assumed it would end quickly. Both sides believed God was on their side. Both sides were wrong. Because the 30 Years' War was not a war of belief. It was a war of identity. A war fought to determine who Europe was allowed to be. Wars like that never end quickly. They end when there's nothing left to burn. Wars destroy cities. But the 30 Years' War destroyed the very idea of what a city was. After the Defenestration of Prague, the Habsburg Emperor Ferdinand II believed he had been chosen, not by politics, but by God himself to save Europe from Protestant chaos. He didn't see rebellion. He saw sin, and sin must be punished. The imperial army marched into Bohemia with priests walking beside the musketeers, chanting hymns as if each soldier carried divine judgment on his shoulder. In 1620, at the Battle of White Mountain, the Protestant cause in Bohemia collapsed in a single afternoon. The Catholic victory was absolute, unquestionable, brutal. What followed was worse. Bohemian nobles were executed, their lands seized, their faith outlawed. It wasn't purification, it was erasure, and Europe took notice. If this was God's justice, then God had chosen a terrifying sword. With Bohemia crushed, Protestant princes across the empire realized something fatal. Ferdinand didn't want negotiation. He wanted obedience. And obedience meant one thing: the end of Protestant Germany. But Germany was not a country. It was hundreds of states, each too small to resist alone. When the emperor's armies advanced, villages didn't fight. They hid. They fled. They prayed. But prayers do not stop cavalry. Town after town fell without a battle, not because they lacked courage, but because they lacked unity. A divided faith cannot resist a united empire. And Europe had just learned how united an empire could be when it believed God was watching. The 30 Years' War is often described as a religious conflict. But ask the men who fought in it, and you get a different answer. Most soldiers weren't fighting for faith, or crown, or ideology. They were fighting for a paycheck. Because the deeper Europe fell into chaos, the more its rulers relied on mercenaries, armies for hire, loyal to gold, faithful to nothing. These mercenaries brought something new to European warfare: a professional, industrialized cruelty. They plundered towns, whether Protestant or Catholic. They burned farms, whether loyal or rebellious. They killed civilians, whether useful or harmless. Armies became locusts, devouring the land that was supposed to feed them. Historians call this the first modern war. But modernity was only a polite word for destruction without restraint. Among the first tragedies of the war was a man named Frederick Fiof, a Protestant prince who accepted the crown of Bohemia just before the empire crushed the rebellion. He ruled for one winter before fleeing into exile. Catholics mocked him as the Winter King. Protestants mourned him as the symbol of a broken dream. His fall was not just political. It was prophetic, a warning that the 30 Years' War would devour not just soldiers, but kings, crowns, and everything fragile enough to believe it could survive the storm. After the victories in Bohemia, Emperor Ferdinand II made the fatal mistake all men with divine certainty make. He believed God had given him momentum. He pushed deeper into Protestant lands, seized more territory, punished more nobles, outlawed more faiths. He believed Europe was bending to his will. What he didn't see was that Europe wasn't bending. It was cracking. Cracks wide enough for foreign powers to see opportunity. Spain, Catholic ally of the empire, saw a chance to expand. The Dutch Republic, Protestant enemy of Spain, saw a chance to weaken the empire. Denmark watched from the north, calculating its moment. The 30 Years' War was no longer a rebellion. It was an invitation. And Europe was full of kings waiting for such an invitation. In 1625, King Christian IV of Denmark entered the war. Not to save Protestantism, though that's what he claimed. He entered to expand his power in Germany and weaken the Habsburgs. The Catholic response was immediate and devastating. Under the command of Albrecht von Wallenstein, a brilliant, cold, terrifying general, the imperial Catholic forces swept through northern Germany like a storm that had finally found direction. Cities fell. Armies collapsed. The Danish intervention ended in humiliation. But something far more important happened. Wallenstein discovered the true nature of this war. If you feed a mercenary army by letting it plunder the land, it will never stop fighting. War would become its own economy. And Europe, poor, starving, broken Europe, would become the currency. By the late 1620s, villages across Germany looked the same. Burned, empty, silent, fields left unplowed, crops stolen or trampled, livestock slaughtered, children gone, churches abandoned, their altars looted, their pews broken for firewood. The 30 Years' War didn't just kill people. It killed the land that kept people alive. And armies, Catholic and Protestant, treated the dead soil as someone else's problem. Because in war, the future is the first casualty. By 1630, the empire seemed unstoppable. Protestant Germany was shattered, Denmark defeated. Wallenstein's armies controlled half the continent. But the continent was growing tired of miracles that only benefited the emperor. And in the far north, across cold waters and colder forests, a new force stepped forward. A king who believed God had chosen him to rescue Protestantism or to burn Europe back into balance. His name was Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden, the man who would turn the war from destruction into transformation. Some wars are decided by faith, some by kings, and some by a single man who understands that bullets and belief are not enemies, but allies. By 1630, Protestant Germany looked less like a region and more like a graveyard. The emperor's armies had burned the land, enslaved the survivors, and outlawed nearly every Protestant authority. If God had chosen a side, it looked like he had made his decision. Then, from the frozen edges of Europe, a storm crossed the Baltic. Gustavus Adolphus, King of Sweden, landed on German soil with an army unlike anything Europe had seen. He wasn't just a king, he was a reformer, a strategist, a man who believed faith meant action, and action required innovation. Germany had been waiting for a savior. Instead, it got a revolutionary. Gustavus didn't bring the largest army. He didn't bring the richest. He didn't bring the most experienced. He brought the most advanced. Mobile artillery that could fire, move, and fire again. European cannons were traditionally gigantic, immobile, slow. Swedish cannons were small, light, and deadly. They turned battlefields into chessboards, and Gustavus played like a grandmaster. Flexible formations, armies in Europe moved like walls, squares of pikemen that could barely turn. Gustavus broke the wall. His infantry moved in thin, mobile lines, supported by cavalry that didn't just charge. They maneuvered. Combined arms tactics for the first time in Europe. Infantry, cavalry, and artillery fought as one coordinated machine. It didn't look like war. It looked like engineering. Moral disciplined Swedish soldiers were forbidden to plunder, forbidden to drink before battle, forbidden to abandon formation, while imperial mercenaries burned villages for food. The Swedish army paid for supplies like a traveling kingdom instead of a horde. This wasn't just a military difference. It was a moral difference. Germany noticed. Gustavus claimed he came to save Protestant Germany. But this was only half the truth. Sweden feared that if the Holy Roman Empire dominated the Baltic, it would choke the Swedish economy and surround the kingdom. Faith and survival had become one thing. It wasn't hypocrisy. It was history. In the 30 Years' War, every king believed God supported him. Gustavus wasn't different. He was just better prepared. In 1631, near the village of Breitenfeld, Gustavus met the imperial forces in a battle that became legendary before the last musket fell silent. The imperial army outnumbered the Swedes. It was led by Tilly, a commander feared across Europe. But numbers don't stop innovation. The battle unfolded like this. The imperial cavalry charged. Swedish lines did not break. Mobile artillery shredded the attackers. Musket volleys staggered the imperial wings. Gustavus personally led a cavalry strike that tore through the enemy flank. By evening, the imperial army was collapsing, its veterans dead, its pride shattered, its myth erased. Breitenfeld wasn't a victory. It was a revelation. The empire could be defeated. Protestants across Europe wept, prayed, celebrated. For the first time in a generation, hope felt real. And hope is more dangerous than any weapon. The emperor responded by recalling one man Europe feared more than plague. Albrecht von Wallenstein. Cold, brilliant, unpredictable. Wallenstein didn't serve God. He didn't serve the emperor. He served Wallenstein. His army was enormous, larger than anything Gustavus could field. He funded it with debts, plunder, and raw intimidation. When Wallenstein marched, it didn't sound like an army. It sounded like a continent breaking, and Germany once again became the battlefield between two visions of destiny: Gustavus's disciplined revolution and Wallenstein's monstrous machine. In 1632, the Titans finally met. The battlefield at Lutzen was choked with fog, a white curtain where men vanished before they died. Swedish musketeers advanced. Wallenstein's artillery thundered. Cavalry clashed in the mist like ghosts with steel bones. And in the chaos, Gustavus Adolphus, the Lion of the North, charged too far forward. He vanished into the fog. Moments later, he was found dead, shot and cut down in the crush of battle. The Swedish army fought on and won, but the victory felt like defeat. A continent asked, if even Gustavus could die, who could save Europe now? The answer, as always in this war, was brutal. No one. After Lutzen, Sweden remained powerful. Its army remained dangerous. Its generals remained loyal. But something essential died with Gustavus: vision. Without his leadership, the Swedes fought because they had begun fighting, not because they saw an end. The Swedish storm had saved Protestant Germany from annihilation, but it could not save Europe from itself. The war would continue. It would grow darker, colder, more senseless, because the heroes were dead and the survivors were simply trying to outlast one another. Gustavus had brought hope. But hope cannot endure forever. Not in a war that no longer remembered why it had begun. The 30 Years' War began as a struggle between Catholic and Protestant. But the moment France entered the battlefield, Europe learned a darker truth. Religion was never the real enemy. France should have stood with the emperor. Both were Catholic. Both claimed loyalty to Rome. Both feared the rise of Protestantism. But France feared something more. The Habsburg Empire, the dynasty ruling both Spain and the Holy Roman Empire, was surrounding France on all sides. Spain to the south, the empire to the east, Spanish Netherlands to the north. If the Habsburgs won the 30 Years' War, France would become a prisoner of geography. And the man who understood this better than anyone was Cardinal Richelieu, the most brilliant, ruthless strategist of the 17th century. Richelieu wore red for the church, but he thought in the colors of power. He believed something Europe wasn't ready to hear. A strong Habsburg Catholic empire was a greater threat to France than a rising Protestant world. So France made a decision that shocked the entire continent. They would join the war on the Protestant side. The moment France sided against the Catholic emperor, every justification for the war collapsed. Priests stumbled over sermons. Kings rewrote speeches. Generals reevaluated their loyalties. Because if Catholic France could fight Catholic Spain while supporting Protestant rebels, then what was this war really about? Faith or fear? Scripture or strategy? For the first time since 1618, Europe began to understand the truth. Religion had been the mask. Power was the face. France's involvement didn't just shift momentum. It transformed the war into something unrecognizable. Until now, the conflict had been devastating, but contained. But France brought something new. Money, manpower, modern organization, a long-term strategy. A total willingness to bleed if it meant Habsburg collapse. This was no longer a war of faith. It became a war of dynasties. A war for mastery of Europe. A war where victory no longer meant salvation, but supremacy. Spain entered the 30 Years' War as one of the greatest empires in human history. The Americas, the richest silver mines on earth, the most feared infantry in Europe, a global empire stretching across oceans. By the 1630s, Spain still looked invincible. But invincible is a word that fools the powerful. Richelieu knew Spain's weakness. It was fighting too many wars at once. Against the Dutch, against internal revolts, against pirates, against debt. against time. France joined the war not to defend Protestantism, but to finish Spain. It worked. Little by little, Spanish prestige cracked. Defeats in the Netherlands, mutinies among unpaid troops, crushing losses against French field armies, revolts in Catalonia and Portugal. The empire that once ruled the world began drowning in the war it thought it could control. Spain did not fall in a single battle. It fell in exhaustion. Meanwhile, inside the empire, something extraordinary happened. Emperor Ferdinand II no longer trusted Wallenstein. Not because Wallenstein was incompetent, he was brilliant. Not because Wallenstein was disloyal, he was necessary. But because Wallenstein had become too powerful and too independent. Rumors spread that Wallenstein planned to negotiate separately with Protestants, that he wanted to replace the emperor's authority, that he believed destiny favored him more than the crown. None of these rumors were proven. But in a war fueled by paranoia, proof becomes irrelevant. In 1634, the emperor ordered Wallenstein's assassination. He was killed not by the enemy, but by his own officers. His death marked a turning point. The empire had lost its only general capable of matching Gustavus Adolphus's legacy. France saw the opening and moved in. Years passed. Armies marched. Armies starved. Armies dissolved. But something deeper was happening. The 30 Years' War had stopped being about goals. No one remembered the original cause. No one believed in the truce that failed. No one cared about Prague or White Mountain anymore. France wanted to weaken Spain. Spain wanted to survive. The empire wanted stability. Sweden wanted influence. German princes wanted autonomy. Mercenaries wanted food. This wasn't war. It was inertia. A fire that kept burning because no one knew how to put it out. While kings and cardinals made plans in marble halls, Germany became a wasteland. Entire regions lost 40% of their population. Some lost 60%. Villages vanished from maps and memory. Cities once filled with scholars, merchants, and craftsmen were reduced to rubble and plague pits. Parents buried children. Children buried parents. Families fled into forests where starvation waited patiently. This was not just destruction. It was unraveling. When France entered the war, the conflict didn't escalate. It metastasized. Europe was no longer fighting for God. It was fighting because it had forgotten any other way to exist. By the late 1630s, the 30 Years' War had become the gravitational center of European politics. No matter what a kingdom wanted, prosperity, stability, prestige, the war pulled it in. The French entry did not choose a side. It created a new war on top of the old one. And somewhere beneath the mud, beneath the ash, beneath the bodies of soldiers who died for causes they didn't understand, Europe began to sense the most terrifying truth of all. This war no longer had an ending. It would end only when everyone involved became too broken to continue, and Europe was very close to that breaking point. Battles decide who wins a war. Famine decides who survives it. By the 1640s, Germany no longer resembled a nation or even a battlefield. It resembled an autopsy, and the first organ to fail was agriculture. Fields had been trampled by cavalry for 2 decades. Wheat stores burned by retreating armies. Livestock slaughtered or stolen. Farmers killed, conscripted, or fled. the land stopped producing. And when the land stops producing, the people stop living. Famine did not arrive like a storm. It arrived like winter. Slow, patient, inevitable. Grain prices multiplied tenfold. Bread became a luxury. Children dug through ash piles searching for unburned kernels. When armies marched through, villagers hid their last scraps of food in graves, in wells, even inside the walls of their homes. But soldiers could smell starvation the way wolves smell fear. And wolves never leave empty-handed. War weakens, hunger breaks, but plague finishes. With bodies unburied, rivers contaminated, and entire districts abandoned, disease found a continent ripe for harvest. Typhus, dysentery, pneumonic plague, fevers that burned families in hours, infections that turned villages into silent horizons. Doctors fled. Priests collapsed at altars. Gravediggers died faster than they could dig. The 30 Years' War didn't just kill. It created the perfect world for death to multiply. And for many towns, disease killed more than sword, bullet, or flame. Because war needs men, plague needs only corpses. As famine deepened and plague thinned the living, new creatures emerged across the landscape. Scavenger bands, not soldiers, not deserters, not criminals. Something worse. People who had survived too much for too long, and no longer remembered what it meant to be human. They roamed forests like packs of wild dogs, armed with makeshift weapons, driven by hunger and madness. They robbed refugees. They emptied graves. They raided burned-out farms for scraps of leather and bones to boil. In normal wars, civilians fear armies. In the 30 Years' War, armies feared the scavengers. Because you can negotiate with soldiers. You cannot negotiate with desperation. If a single event defined a horror of this war, it was the destruction of Magdeburg in 1631. What happened there is still studied as one of the worst massacres in European history. Imperial Catholic forces broke into the city. Street fighting collapsed into chaos. A fire, still unexplained, ignited and spread through neighborhoods packed with civilians. People ran to churches for shelter. The churches caught fire. Parents threw children from windows to soldiers below, begging them to save at least one life. Many were cut down before they hit the ground. When the smoke finally cleared, over 20,000 civilians were dead. Some historians say 25,000. Others say 30,000. What matters is the silence that followed. Magdeburg didn't fall. Magdeburg disappeared. The massacre became the symbol of the war. Not faith, not justice, not victory. Obliteration. Even Catholic commanders were horrified at what they had done. But the war continued. Because wars this big do not stop for moral discomfort. Children who survived the 1640s did not play games or learn to read or dream of guilds and universities. They learned to recognize the colors of different armies, so they knew when to run. They learned which abandoned houses still had edible roots beneath the floorboards. They learned to sleep lightly because soldiers didn't care if a child was awake or dreaming. They grew up not with lullabies, but with the sound of boots crunching burned soil. A generation raised in ashes cannot love peace. They can only fear its fragility. Before the war, the Holy Roman Empire was a mosaic of laws, guilds, traditions, and rites. During the war, these structures shattered. Courts ceased to function, markets stopped operating, currency lost value, roads became hunting grounds. In many regions, there was no government, only whoever had the most weapons. Any sense of order, economic, political, legal, evaporated. The war did not just destroy armies, it destroyed meaning. The idea that a town had identity, that a people had history, that a future existed. This erasure was more damaging than any battle. Because you can rebuild a wall, you cannot rebuild a broken memory. By the early 1640s, every major power in Europe was exhausted. Spain bankrupt, France bleeding, Sweden overstretched. The empire hollowed out, German princes desperate for survival. And still, the war crawled forward like a wounded animal that refused to die. Victory stopped mattering. Losses stopped shocking. People stopped counting the dead because the numbers no longer made sense. Europe had reached a moment no civilization should ever reach. The war continued not because anyone believed in it, but because no one remembered how to end it. As the war dragged into its third decade, one question began spreading through the ruined towns and starving villages. If God had guided this war, what kind of God would allow this? It was a question neither Catholics nor Protestants could answer. Because the 30 Years' War did not simply shatter Europe, it shattered European faith. Not in religion, but in the idea that religion could ever again serve as a compass for human certainty. The war had shown something terrifying. When nations believe they are fighting for God, they stop fighting like humans. And the cost is always the same. Everything. Wars end when the victors triumph. The 30 Years' War ended when everyone realized there were no victors left. By 1645, Europe had reached a point no continent should ever reach. There was no strength left to continue killing. Spain could not pay its troops. Sweden could not replace its dead. France could not defeat famine. The Holy Roman Empire could barely govern itself. The war had devoured armies, then cities, then nations, and finally hope. What remained was exhaustion. A deeper, heavier force than any cannon or cavalry charge. Exhaustion ends wars the way gravity ends flight. Slowly, inevitably. Without glory, peace talks began in 1644, but progress stalled for years. Not because the sides disagreed, but because no one could remember what the war had originally been about. Was it Prague, Protestantism, dynasties, territory, Spain, Sweden, France, the Empire? The truth was simple. The 30 Years' War had lasted longer than the reasons that began it. Negotiators argued over maps that no longer reflected reality, titles that no longer had meaning, and rights that belonged to populations that no longer existed. It was diplomacy in the shadow of a vanished world. Finally, in 1648, after 4 years of negotiation and 3 decades of destruction, Europe signed a treaty that historians still revere, the Peace of Westphalia. This treaty did more than end a war. It created the foundations of the modern world. Sovereignty. Each ruler could choose the religion of his state. No pope, no emperor, no king above other kings. A radical idea. No one speaks for God in politics. Equality of states, small states, gained legal standing equal to that of empires. Weakness was no longer a death sentence. New borders and new balances, France rose. Spain declined. Sweden gained territory. German princes gained autonomy. The end of universal Christendom. For 1,000 years, Europe imagined itself a single Christian civilization. Westphalia shattered that dream and replaced it with something more realistic. Independent nations living beside one another instead of under one faith. This was not just peace. It was rebirth. A rebirth built on the graves of a generation. The Holy Roman Empire did not fall in 1648, but it died in spirit. Westphalia stripped the emperor of the authority he had fought 3 decades to preserve. Princes gained power. The central government faded. The empire remained on maps, but only as a faint echo of what it once tried to be. It survived physically precisely because it surrendered politically. A strange truth. The empire saved itself by admitting it could no longer rule. When the treaties were signed, the kings, diplomats, and cardinals celebrated. The survivors did not. How do you celebrate when your family is gone? How do you rejoice when your town is a ruin and your church an empty stone shell? How do you speak of peace when the war took everything language once expressed? For many Europeans, the end of the war was not a triumph. It was a release, not into victory, into emptiness. From this emptiness, a new world would slowly grow. But the people of 1648 did not see a new world. They saw a graveyard, and graveyards do not celebrate peace. They endure it. The 30 Years' War did not just devastate Europe physically. It destroyed something deeper. Belief. Belief that rulers were guided by God. Belief that religion could unify nations. Belief that suffering had purpose. Belief that the old world had ever truly been stable. When Europe looked at what it had done, it could no longer pretend that faith and power had ever lived in harmony. The war revealed a brutal truth. When empires fight in God's name, it is rarely God who wins. Some wars end when one side triumphs. The 30 Years' War ended when Europe realized there was no triumph left to find. Europe entered the war believing it was fighting for salvation. It emerged realizing it had been fighting for illusions. The 30 Years' War is remembered as the moment the continent nearly died. But its deepest legacy is what survived. A new understanding of what power is, of what faith is, of what nations are allowed to be. Before the war, Europe believed unity came from God. After the war, Europe understood unity could only come from humanity, from negotiation, from sovereignty, from coexistence instead of domination. It took 30 years to learn that lesson. 30 years of massacres, famines, plagues, and extinction-level suffering. 30 years to realize that no continent has ever been saved by certainty. Only by humility. Westphalia did not bring peace because Europe suddenly grew wise. It brought peace because Europe finally learned fear. Fear of what it had done. Fear of what it could do again. Fear of a world without restraint. From the ashes of this fear, modern Europe was born. And the 30 Years' War, the war that began with men throwing envoys out a window, became the war that ended the idea of a single Christian empire forever. The war that killed millions but taught one unforgettable truth. When you fight for God, without questioning your own ambition, you do not build a holy world. You burn the one you already have.